Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. As always, I'm Rob Nelson.
And I'm Mike Bakov. And hey, Rob, what kind of student were you in school?
I was, I'm not going to say it. It's right there in front of me.
I bet you were good. I bet you were A's, but I was a little less than that. I was more of a B student. Sorry. I do drone on.
Oh, behave, Mike.
Well, we're talking about bees and beekeeping today, which is kind of has kind of a rich historical topic than I thought it would be.
Yeah, there's a lot of different angles, and there's just a ton of information out there depending on what direction you want to go into. Today, we're going to be talking with Kay Sanova and Carrie Stouffer from our Stuhr Museum's curatorial and interpretation staff about the history of beekeeping, and then and in section 2, we're going to be talking with an amateur hobbyist beekeeper, Dustin Schmidt, who has been beekeeping for several years now.
One of the things I've noticed about beekeepers is when you get them on the subject, they're very happy to talk about it, and Dustin was no exception. So this will be a fun podcast. Let's buzz to it.
Yeah. Hello again, and welcome to another episode of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. I'm joined today by Director of Interpretation Kay Sanova and Curator of Stuhr Museum Carrie Stouffer.
Hi.
Thanks to the both of you for being on the show.
Happy to be here.
So today we are talking about another fascinating topic, and that is, of course, beekeeping. Mm-hmm. What is it? Where does it come from? And why did it get here?
Okay, let's ask the broad question.
Generally speaking, how long have people been beekeeping?
Hundreds of thousands of years. Going back to at least there's varying accounts, but one that I found was 7,000 BCE in the Middle East, and spreading out from there. North Africa, the Middle East, Southern Europe. All of that, and it just kind of
China, early Egyptian.
Yeah,
there's all over the place. There's different areas where there were bees.
I know ancient Egypt is the prominent one that if anyone is doing research on this, they'll find countless examples of the ways that the bee was employed, both in terms of beeswax production and also in honey. Correct.
Well, and even King Tut's tomb had jars of sealed honey in it, so it was highly prized during that time.
There was at least one person who was preserved in honey.
Oh, really?
Their remains. Yes, their remains.
In ancient Egypt?
I'm not sure if it was ancient. Was that?
I'm not sure.
Was it Alexander the Great? I can't remember who it was.
I'm not sure, but they used honey in all sorts of rituals, and then also the beeswax for that too. So they would seal different things and include it in their pottery artwork,
and also for their makeup type stuff.
Their makeup, hair. I think.
They would do the slick down. If you want that slick back look, that would be the way to do it.
Sculptured look.
Yeah. There's a ton of uses for beeswax as well. I mean, like people have made it into soap. They've made it into candles. Mm-hmm. All sorts of things like that. It's
or just to eat it.
Oh, really?
Not to eat the wax, but I mean to actually eat the honeycomb.
Eat the
is
comb.
Amazing. I love that.
Well, there's also I don't know, it was specifically beeswax. I know wax. They would make some small wax doll ornament type things for
I read
Christmas.
That.
Of course, you wouldn't want to get it very close to a candle on a Christmas tree or anything. I use beeswax all the time for my thread. I pull my thread through hunks of beeswax in order to keep it from knotting up as I'm doing hand sewing.
Well, that's what I was going to ask the both of you at some point was, are there, we all work at a museum. Are there areas of your profession that you employ beeswax on a regular basis?
I use a combination of beeswax and soap for this, but if you have a drawer that's kind of like sticky, if you take it out and run it underneath the edges and kind of lubricate that, and also windows that don't go up and down very well, beeswax or soap both work. Sometimes there's beeswax in the soap. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and beeswax is, a part of a lot of natural furniture waxes and patinas and all sorts of things that you would use to protect the covering of a furniture.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's actually used quite often, and probably honey and beeswax together are used just as much as there would have been in ancient Egypt or something like that as far as uses go.
And decoratively, they would
Except being buried in. Sorry.
Yeah,
I don't
that's
think
true.
we do that.
Yeah, no. I know in Poland and some other middle European areas, they would use the wax and as kind of a resistant. So they would, as they would make different dyes, kind of, and batiking also, they would use it.
Yeah, well, and it's a huge encaustic painting is very big right now, and that definitely I think the more beautiful encaustic paintings have the beeswax instead of a synthetic resin. Very, very
There's
many
just
different
something
applications.
rich and lush about beeswax. It's just its texture compared to the paraffin is just so
It's
rich.
different, yeah.
Well, before anyone in America could use it, it had to get here first.
Yes.
Because the honeybee, as we all know, is not native to North America. So how did it get here?
It came with the settlers.
Yeah.
The initial settlers, about in the 1600s, 17th century time period, Virginia and New England.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think as different cultures came over, I think that it probably kept coming over in waves as different cultures would come, because they would have their like home hives that they might, they've got their special pet bees that they might bring with them.
Yeah, you can actually see this is documented. Beginning in 1622 in the Virginia colony is the first shipment that makes its way over to North America, followed shortly thereafter by Massachusetts in the 1630s. Then you get into the 1640s. It comes to Connecticut. It comes to New York in 1670, Pennsylvania 1698. It begins going a little bit further west, brought to California and from the eastern United States to California in the 1850s. So you can kind of track this like westward expansion of Americans in general with bee migration as well.
And there were always those bees that kind of skipped town and kind of went out on their own and created these wild groups of bees. And so they would have hives set in fallen trees or upright trees that were hollowed out and all kinds of different areas. So inside houses.
Yeah. There was like a rule of like 3 miles. Like if you set up a beehive, like another hive could form 3 miles away. And then once that one had become established, another 3 miles
it just kind of hopscotch across the country.
Yeah, lots of bee statutes and legislation right along with the bees. I mean, and Nebraska started early on in that too. Because, I mean, to start new product and new agriculture items and new trees, anything really, you wanted to have those bees and you wanted to set them up right away so that you could get the best pollination and the best chance of success.
Yeah.
It was very early in Nebraska.
And they've documented wild hives during the Lewis and Clark expedition along the Missouri River. I think this needs to be checked out, but Floyd found a beehive and some wild bees and consumed a whole bunch of the honey, and it said that it may have contributed to his demise. But most sources say that he died from an appendicitis. But that is 1804, 1805, that there's wild honey bee hives in the Nebraska area.
This is Sergeant Floyd,
yes,
the one person on that expedition who did die.
Correct.
And it may have,
It may or may not have been a contributing factor to his demise.
Eating too much honey from a wild honeycomb.
Because according to the source that I read, is he consumed a copious amount of the honey from that hive. Now, I don't find that consuming a great deal of honey is offensive, but you don't know what else was in that honey. Since it was a wild hive and it was inside, I think they said it was like a tree trunk or something. And so it could have been all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah. Well,
could have been all kinds of other stuff.
You set up a hive, there's a lot of sanitation and procedure that goes along with it. So
yeah,
those are for a reason.
Yes, yes, very much so for a reason. But they're early people who came to Nebraska. as they were planting all these different types of plants, they wanted to have pollinators. And so the pollinators that they knew and trusted were the honeybees.
Well, like when I was researching this topic, I was pretty fascinated by like sort of some of the primitive methods that were used to actually do the beekeeping itself. Like I was particularly interested in like the bee smoker and just the process of how they weren't able to actually maintain their bee populations year to year. They were forced to kill them because they didn't have like a way to extract.
Yeah, it was really kind
the
of
material.
Cool yeah.
So like essentially they would physically blow smoke using some form of like primitive bee smoker and just like some sort of burlap sack over their head, or like some sort of variation of what has evolved into become the current beekeeping apparatus.
It must have been very challenging to be a beekeeper.
Well, it to me, I guess what I'm trying to say is that like even at the early stages, we're talking like 1850s, or like these are kind of the processes that are happening. People realized how important this substance was and they were willing to go confront a hive of bees in order to get this, honey or beeswax out of it.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to the fact that, this is a multi-generational, thousands of years thing. Mm-hmm. And I think I've never done this, but I would think if you looked at it, you're always going to have some sort of protection, and you're always going to have the smoker.
I think that every beekeeper probably had their methods that they found to be tried and true, and they would kind of pass that down to multi-generational. I was just thinking, as a genealogist, a lot of people's last names were associated with their trade, the initial trade, and I'm going, I wonder if there's something with beekeeper that I know that there has been the last name of bee out there, but whether or not there's something that relates to beekeeping as a last name that gets passed down.
Or maybe like something with apiculturalist, something like that, but some kind of derivation.
I know I don't know.
That'd be interesting.
Back to the beehive though, when they used to like exterminate the whole hive to get the honey. I thought it was really interesting. Did you read about how the change in that occurred when somebody learned that instead of putting the hives right up to each other, which would kind of stick them together, and so you really had to pull them and pull the hive apart to get to the bee. If you left 1 centimeter,
just
then
gave
the bees,
them a little space.
and then you could see, and then that's what changed it all, was that 1 centimeter. I thought that was a very distinct time in history that you can point to the whole process changing. Yeah. Even though you're still going to go out there with a smoker and the hood and everything, it really changed from a start and stop thing to a seasonal, we can keep this going. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, beginning like that, what Carrie's talking about is a man by the name of L.L. Langstroth, a congressional minister from Pennsylvania, patented that very device in 1852, which was a movable frame system that is still in use today by many beekeepers, which allowed it to be like sort of a reproductive hive system that didn't have to be completely destroyed and then recreated with every passing year.
Stackable, and you could do all kinds of different things with it.
And that's just, a few years, 15 years before Nebraska statehood.
Yeah.
And we have our own notable Nebraskan beekeepers.
Yes.
Starting with none other than William Staley, isn't that correct?
William Staley was really into beekeeping to the point that he was published writing about bees in some of the magazines of the 19th century, both national and I believe at the state level, because there was a state association that formed on February 8th of 1879, the Nebraska Beekeepers Association, and they formed in Omaha. Now, his name's not on the list of the initial formers in that, but I have run across a number of instances where he is mentioned in these beekeeping magazines for various assorted sundry things. And because he was very involved in finding out what plant life grew best in the Nebraska climate. He was documenting all this. He was bringing plants from different parts of the world to see if they grew in Nebraska, and tracking it. We have some of the books that talk about the different varieties that he would get. But he also needed pollinators. And
Sure.
so he had my favorite again is this picture of him in front of this kind of a shed-like structure, and there's all these bee hives, just this long row of beehives, and then he's seated in a chair right in front of all the beehives, just obviously very proud of the beehives and the beekeeping. And he also would win awards at the state fair and at the Hall County Fair for his honey and other produce.
Yeah, we're going to be talking with Dustin Schmidt, who's a hobbyist beekeeper in the next segment of the podcast today. He has 2 hives that he maintains as a beekeeper. I read one article that said William Staley had 60.
Yes.
Which just speaks to his
dedication.
Yeah, there's the word.
Dedication
to the craft. I mean, that
Because-
must have taken an extraordinary amount of time and effort and patience and all of the rest.
And I kind of wonder if the shed, you can't really tell which way the shed faced because it was open on one side, but the back side was closed off. So I wonder if that back side was to the north, which might help to protect that. It'd be interesting to see if we could find a lot of the articles that he wrote where he talks about beekeeping. I'm not sure just how much. I haven't really explored it in the archives, what we have there. That
We
he
do.
talks
We
about.
have a lot of the magazine articles. We have a lot of the volumes. And we do have journal entries where he was making notes on those. We also have probably 12 of his actual beehives.
Oh, wow.
We have the beehive scraper that you would scrape the honeycomb and the honey off of.
And his extractor.
And we have his extractor. He was very good about sharing his knowledge and then the family sharing the actual equipment with us. I know several years, I'm not sure what we're doing this year, but I know several years they've had the equipment set up so the students can see it. And
Yeah, it's a part of one
Kinda
of our
see.
HATS classes where we talk about bee culture, and we have an extractor down there so that we can show them how it spins because it's patented in 1865. And so that was a game changer, again, in beekeeping because it made it a lot easier to extract the honey. But we have examples of a comb with honey in it, and we have some kind of like posters that talk about the life cycle of the bee. So the students in that class can learn a little bit about pollinators and honeybees in particular.
Yeah, I mean, Kay, you mentioned the honeybee. There are over 20,000 different species of bee, but we're really only talking about one. Because
Yes.
there's only one that actually creates honey that is consumed by humans.
The honeybee is the only one European. There is one other bee that produces honey, but I do not know that it is consumed, and it's called the stingless bee.
Oh.
But out of the 20,000, there's one. So it's and we're learning more and more just how important those bees are and how important it is for us to kind of help protect them.
And the fancy Latin name for that honeybee is called an Apis mellifera, which literally means honey-bearing bee.
Correct.
which is also our state insect.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Oh, the honeybee is?
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
It is. It also happens to be like 8 other states
Yes.
state insect. But yeah,
Well, as an
What you just
agricultural state, I mean, I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
that it has a colossal impact on our economy for a whole host of reasons, a whole host of crops that are affected by its pollination.
Any place where you've got like fruit-bearing trees, that's going to be really important to have bees around to help pollinate. In fact, a lot of times you see hive super set up within where all of these trees are, so that they can go out and then not only do they have the fruit that they sell, but they're selling the honey as well.
Yeah.
All right, I looked it up. I think I said 8 There's 18 other states.
18, so
That's
19
short.
total.
Yeah.
Be original.
But yes, 1975, honeybee, go Nebraska.
I'll take it. Well, that's all the questions that I had prepared. Did anybody come across anything that they were just jonesing to get out there that I didn't cover?
No, I was really excited about the 20,000 species part because I did not know that. When I was looking at that, I knew that there were a lot, but I didn't know it was 20,000 a lot.
Well, we are going to be talking with Dustin Schmidt, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, who is a amateur hobbyist beekeeper, and he's going to answer a lot more questions about the specifics of the beekeeping process, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of being a beekeeper. So if anyone has any questions about those aspects, those are coming to you right after these messages. So stick with us, and we'll be back after these words.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Railroad Town Livery. Fine teams and shiny buggies are at your service at the Railroad Town Livery Barn, north of the Siebler Blacksmith Shop. Prompt attention to all callers. The best of accommodations in feed and care of teams. Commercial trade is solicited.
Welcome back to another episode of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. I am joined today by Dustin Schmidt, amateur hobbyist beekeeper who's been beekeeping for several years now. Dustin, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So you were kind of talking about, before we kind of went live here, of just getting into the nitty gritty, the details of beekeeping. How does one get involved in beekeeping? As you know, I'm not one who knows a whole lot about the subject.
Yeah.
How did you get into this subject,
So
I guess?
there's tons of different ways to get involved in beekeeping and doing research and just planting pollinator plants can help with the bees and then diving into beekeeping. I got into beekeeping. I was actually an instructor at the community college in Hastings, Nebraska as a culinary instructor, and went to a sustainability conference and sat in on some beekeeping lectures or breakout conferences, workshops, and really kind of started diving into it. Prior to that, I had talked to a few people that were into beekeeping, and they started working through how colonies work and what roles certain bees play. And I found it very interesting. So then going to the sustainability conference kind of led more into that and got back and started doing some more research. And I ended up taking a beginning beekeeping class through the same community college that I was working for. We started some bees on the Hastings campus when I was there, and then it kind of manifested into some other things. Then I did the Big Idea Hastings pitch, little quick pitch, and did a idea for rooftop beekeeping. Wanted to put beehives on top of the roofs in Hastings, and must have been persuasive enough because I won. And so with the money, I took that and kind of invested into some equipment and kind of formed a business. And
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about. That is such a unique concept. Could you tell me a little bit about what it is that you do in the industry?
So I work right now. I'm an executive chef for a restaurant group that we've just formed in Hastings called Knife and Fork Concepts, which is we have Odyssey, which is up and running now, which is in downtown Hastings. And then we'll be soon opening in around mid-July, Blue Fork Kitchen in Hastings as well, which will be another restaurant, a little more casual, family-friendly than what we're doing right now at Odyssey. So I'm in the culinary field. I work as a chef and also beekeep on the side because I think it's very important that people know how important bees are to the food that we're eating, and then how beneficial the honey that's produced by the bees can be to diet and helping allergies and things of that nature. So the honey that I produce now through my business as an amateur or hobbyist beekeeper, the majority of it I sell to the restaurants.
Cool. So, how many buildings are you on top of?
I don't have any on top of any buildings right now. That was the hard thing to do, was to find locations or properties that were going to allow that to happen. And I got really busy with my career,
Sure.
and not just my hobby. So that's kind of been on the back burner. So I have a few hives out in the country on some property, and right now I'd love to get them into a more urban environment and on top of rooftops, because it's wasted space and there's
Sure.
plenty of potential things for bees to pollinate and collect from. And there's some science out there that people will question that the bees are possibly have a better chance of survival from insecticides and some of the chemicals that we're spraying if they're in an urban environment, as opposed to being out in the country where they can collect from any source. So
Yeah. You mentioned that Nebraska is, impacted by the beekeeping industry. Like in what ways would you say are most prevalent?
So in most ways, I'd say that it's just from the food that we're eating, right? It might not necessarily be grown in Nebraska, but they say that 1 out of every 3 bites that a person consumes is a direct result of pollination from one species of bee or
Wow.
another.
That's crazy.
Most commercial beekeepers they'll move their bees out. They transport them on large trucks and they'll take them out to the almonds in California. And then it's they just do migratory pollination of crops, and then they end back. Some of them are in the Midwest and they spend time in South Dakota and Nebraska and the prairies and do their honey collection or major nectar flow. And then they'll go south, and that's where they'll do their overwintering since it's warmer, and they can establish new colonies and do their breedings and then provide that for other beekeepers.
You mentioned a lot of things I wanted to ask you about right there
for
in
sure.
that little.
Sorry.
No, that's great. One of the things was just like how important bees are to food production. I read in a study that in the U.S., the U.S. production of crops that depend on pollinators generates about $50 billion a year just in the U.S.
Yeah.
Like I did not know that they have just like a monumental impact in that way.
And there's so many things that can have an effect on the bees themselves, from different pests and pesticides, like I mentioned before, that it's very important that we're aware and knowledgeable of the impacts that what we do can affect another being or insect like a bee, which can then have a direct result on what we're eating or ingesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that you mentioned was their nectar making process. I didn't know much about bees before I kind of went down the rabbit hole the other night with this, but apparently they have 2 stomachs. Yeah. Honeybee, like they have a stomach that they, eat food with, but then they have a honey stomach. Yeah. A nectar stomach, I guess, where they. Can you talk about a little bit more about that? I don't know.
So
what
when
I'm
they
talking about.
collect, they'll collect off of flowers or budding trees or things of that nature. They collect the nectar out of it, and it's not honey until it comes back into the hive. And it's really pretty fascinating. They'll go collect the nectar and then bring it to the hive, and sometimes they just walk right into the entrance of the hive, and they then regurgitate, I guess, the nectar. And will pass it on to another worker bee that's in the colony. And that worker bee will take it up and store it in the honeycomb. And then it's not technically categorized as honey until it has to be below a certain, between 16 and 18% like water moisture level. And they'll put a wax capping over the top of it. And at that point, the nectar's been dehydrated enough that it turns into a sugar or a honey.
Is that where the beeswax comes from, or is that something else?
So the beeswax they produce that. It becomes scales on their undersides, and then they just form and mold it as it goes. It actually takes. I couldn't tell you the exact amount. I'd have to look it up, unfortunately. But it takes. I want to say more than a pound of honey to produce. I can't. The statistic is spacing right now, but it takes a whole lot of honey or nectar to produce like 1 pound of wax.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
No. I had another crazy statistic that, and you were talking about the climate. that roughly 60 pounds of honey or more is needed for an average colony just to survive like a winter in Nebraska.
Yes.
Like that again, that like from such a small insect.
So this is it's true, very true. and the bad thing about this year, actually, going into winter, I had 3 strong hives. Coming out when I did my inspection at the beginning of March, or when I had a warm day, when I went to look at my hives, all of them had like there was no survival.
Oh, really?
Which is horrible, because then when I'm going through the hives, I'm looking and there's plenty of honey stores left. So what can happen is the bees will cluster around the queen in the wintertime so that they all can stay warm, right? They self-regulate themselves through the winter and summer. And so they keep themselves warm in the wintertime. Well, it was really cold this winter. So sometimes they can't move. They can't even, it's not even warm enough for them to move in that cluster, because they have to break apart a little bit to get to the next food source. And which can be an inch, or it could be on another frame in the hive, but they just can't get apart enough to even get that inch to more food.
How many different kinds of bee are we talking about? Like in a colony? Like
in a colony,
there's a queen. I know
there's a queen. Then you have worker bees and foragers, and then you have
drones. Yeah, that's another.
The drones are the male, and they have no stinger, and their sole mission in life is to mate with a queen and eat all the stores in the hives. So around when we're leaving from fall to the beginning of winter, so let's say I've seen them being kicked out in September. Typically it's October, around in between that area. The worker bees will start to kick the drones out, and then they won't allow them back in. So it's a female dominated society. Yeah. So they're bigger, so they take up more space too, and they eat more. So they kick them out because the queen in the wintertime or in this area will not leave the hive. And so she won't lay any eggs throughout the winter. So there's no need to have drones around. So really they get kicked out, and then they they don't survive. So.
Yeah. But even if you're doing everything right, it can just be a wintertime that is too much to handle.
Because like I said, my hives were very strong going into winter, had plenty of resources, and they didn't make it.
What are some of the other things that like a typical beekeeper has to be aware of when they're, maybe not necessarily getting through the winter, but just generally, like how much upkeep does a hive need?
Yeah. So in the mid, like amateur hobbyist, it's a lot different than a commercial beekeeper. Commercial beekeepers may check their yards or apiaries once a month going through the middle of summer. I typically check mine through the middle of summer about once a week. Right now, every other week to every week. When it gets closer to fall and after I've harvested honey or taken honey off of the hives, then it'll be every 2 weeks, and then winterize, and you can't do anything to them in the winter, really.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, what all does that entail? Like, somebody who's new to like kind of studying and looking into this craft, it looks like there's a lot that goes into it. There's a whole apparatus. Yeah, there's different tools.
So when I did the original pitch, when I did the big idea pitch, I didn't think I estimated very low, and I didn't think I estimated very high. For somebody to get into beekeeping, and we typically recommend that you do 2 hives if you have the area for it, just so you can compare differences throughout the year. And if you need to take resources from one hive and put it into another to make it stronger, you have that ability. So 2 hives with all the equipment that you need. So there's some people run deep boxes for their brood boxes, which would be 2 deeps, and then honey supers are a smaller box and frames for that. You can get into it for, I mean, it's an expensive hobby.
Yeah.
But to get 2 hive setups, a veil, and all the like equipment that you need to get started, and bees, you can do it for $1,000 or less. I would recommend that you find a mentor that can help you through, at the very least, if not as well as taking like a beginning beekeeping class. It's just good to be around other people that have similar interests, and you can bounce questions off of each other, and being mentored or going to class and being taught by somebody that's had a lot of experience is also helpful. There's tons of information out there. But
yeah, there really is. I was just really kind of taken back by it, honestly. How much space though you said if you had if you start out with 2, is that something someone can do in their own typical backyard, or do you need a little bit more?
Grand Island city limits they actually will allow you to have hives in Grand Island. I'm not sure the amount that is, but they require you to have a certification of so many hours of a beginning beekeeping class. I'm pretty sure that's still the same. Hastings, however, I think you can have 2, and they don't require any verification of a beekeeper's class, but you can also have them in your backyard as well. It doesn't take very much space. It's probably a 3x4 space would be adequate. Hastings requires that your neighbors are okay with it. It's has to be a few feet off the property line, and it has to have a fly wall in front of the hive entrance. Because when the bees leave the hive, they go out and up. So having the fly wall in front of their entrance would reinforce that behavior and make sure they go elevated and instead into somebody else's backyard.
Like local ordinance or like neighborhood coalition against stuff like that. Because I mean, there's like several thousand bees in each hive.
Oh yeah,
right? Like 50,000.
So when you get a new when a person is to order a new hive, you have to order bees, right? I mean, they come in the mail unless you know somebody local that you can buy a colony from, a nucleus colony or a full colony. Typically, most people order a package of bees, which is 3 pounds of bees, and it's about and it has a queen in it, and they come in a cage, and the queen's in her own little cage, and then they have a feeder can with sugar syrup in it that's to stimulate nectar or replace nectar so they can be fed as they're in transport.
I mean, that makes sense.
So then you have to, it's quite fascinating actually, but you take when the package comes, you take it and you remove the can and you pull the queen out, and there's some bees on the queen, and make sure your queen's alive. And you open your hive box or your brood box, and you take a couple frames out, and then you spray your bees with some sugar syrup too, because then they're more worried about cleaning themselves and not flying. And then you just shake them into the hive.
All right.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. It's fun to watch. But
okay.
So that's 3 pounds of bees.
Yeah, how many is 3 pounds of bees?
10,000.
Yeah.
I think roughly 10,000 bees plus the queen. It might be a little more than that. And then
they reproduce.
Yeah, then they reproduce. The queen will be she will be bred at that point. And productive laying queens, most of the studies now are saying they'll lay productively for 2 years. Some people will say they've had queens lay to up to 5 years. But they go on one mating flight, and they mate with a number of drones, and then they'll lay anywhere from up to 1,500 eggs in a day.
Wow.
So for that period, it's a long, and that's their whole mission, is just to reproduce. So the queen knows by the pheromones in the hive what type of egg she needs to lay. So if it's the beginning of the year, she needs to lay drones. So there's males in the area. And that way, if the hive gets too big too fast or it runs out of room, she can then lay a queen in one of the cups. She'll lay a queen egg. The workers will form a queen cell, and she'll take half of the hive with her, and they'll split. It's kind of their natural way of survival and
this will all maybe take place within
it
that
can
first-
happen. It can happen. Right now is the biggest time. From May through July is like swarm season.
Wow.
So they just populate so quickly that
Mhm.
if, as a beekeeper, if you're not on top of that, we can manipulate them so that we split the hive when we see that occurring, and move and create new hives off of the one hive, which is essentially what they're doing naturally. Only when they do it, they take off and you might not see them again. Lots of us put swarm traps up so that somewhere around our yards, so that they can hopefully, if they are to split and we don't catch it before it happens, then they'll go into one of our equipment and we saved all those bees. But
So guarding against swarms, guarding against weather, you mentioned pesticides a little bit earlier. Is there anything else that, is...
Well, they have natural pests too. There's the biggest one is a Varroa Mite, and it's a little, it actually, they can spread from hive to hive to hive.
Oh, wow.
And if you don't treat your bees with there's some organic ways and there's some natural ways of doing it. The treatment that I use is called Hop Guard, and it's made from hops that are used to brew beer. So it's a more natural or organic way of treating. But the Varroa mites will take over a hive, and if you have not a very high population going into the winter, they'll demise because of the mites. And they just kind of float around on the bees and feed off of the bees and things in the hive, but they breed inside the drone cells, the male cells, because they can multiply. You can come out of one cell with multiple mites.
That's crazy.
And there's other...
all sorts of things, I'm sure.
There's other different pests and things that bees can succumb to as well. But
do you run into anyone who's just completely off base about beekeeping, or are there any kind of misconceptions that you've come across from anyone?
So honeybees, for example, they're an invasive species. They weren't naturally in the United States, right? So they're an imported invasive. People will argue that they're an invasive species, which I can agree and disagree with, right? I mean, there's some studies out there that people will say that native bees are more efficient pollinators, but you don't also get the benefit of being able to move a native bee colony around the country to pollinate crops that are then feeding the people. Like, that's a back and forth argument that I think is a whole nother podcast, probably.
Yeah. Well, you are one of, I looked up, there are 46,000 honey producing hives in Nebraska, and you've got how many of them?
I have 2 right now.
Well, there you go. So you're part of a big club that I feel like is growing.
And it is. There's a Nebraska Beekeepers Association that I'm a part of. I'm a member of.
300 members of that organization in Nebraska.
And the vice president of the Nebraska Beekeeping Association, Brian Nielsen, he's been the instructor for the beginning beekeeping class at the community college right across the street here in Grand Island at the CCC campus. He's done that, and I think he's doing advanced beekeeping now, where they're moving into more topics on how to breed queens and things like that.
Well, I guess I would just ask if you were going to advise someone who was new to the topic and was looking to get into, being a beekeeper, what would you recommend to them?
Do your research. First and foremost, do your research. Read, watch videos, and then find a mentor, take a class. But it all really goes down to hands-on experience.
Sure.
I think you can read and watch videos and take a class as much as the next person, but you don't really get the full grasp of it until you're inside and working a hive and seeing all the things that you've been looking at or reading about. And take your time, listen and watch what's going on and ask questions. You can ask, beekeepers say it's like asking a farmer.
Sure.
You can ask a beekeeper three beekeepers the same question, and you'll get 3 different answers.
I believe it.
So we all don't do the same things, but everybody enjoys bees and they love to talk about them. So I was honored to be asked to participate in this.
Yeah, for sure. I really enjoyed having you. It was a great conversation.
Definitely. It was good. Anytime I can talk about bees for a few minutes is a good time. So.
Absolutely. Dustin Schmidt, thank you for being on the podcast.
All right. Thank you.
And that's going to do it for us. Another episode of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast in the books. I had fun with this one, Mike.
Man, very interesting topic. Dustin sure did like to talk about bees and did so very well. And it's enough to make you want to go start your own colony.
Yeah. If you happen to miss out on this episode or any of the other ones, don't be afraid to go ahead and be kind and rewind.
Terrible. Well, next week we are going to dive into the history of the Runza sandwich, which I think is going to be kind of a very interesting podcast. It's got a lot of history to it as well. And man, between all this honey talk and now we're going to talk about sandwiches, I think it's about probably about lunchtime, isn't it?
Yeah. This one hits close to home for me as a kid who grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, and loved going to Rock and Roll Runza. I'm going to get to the bottom of the mystery as to why there is no longer one.
Yep. So, all right, join us next week when we talk about that, and we'll be back real soon. Thank you for listening.
High five, guys.
Thanks, Carrie.